never, ever forget the feeling that I had when we took off. Um, it felt as if this broken, damaged, sad person stayed on the ground, and there was this new creature that was up in the air, and he was excited and happy and learning and growing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moeller Real Estate and Business Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Moeller, and on this podcast, we will be interviewing guests that have made their mark in real estate, in business, and in other areas of life. Listening to podcasts myself has helped me in so many different ways and continues to do so. If you're a real estate investor or an entrepreneur, or aspiring to be either, or just someone that wants to learn, you've come to the right place. An easy way to have an impact is to share this episode with friends or family, provide a review, or just spread the word. We greatly appreciate it, and now let's get to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moeller Real Estate and Business Podcast. Very excited for this week's guest, Mr. Alan Underwood. Alan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Well, we were just getting to know each other a little bit on the pre-call, so I'm excited to get into your story, though. It's really intriguing. But to introduce Alan, so from Arizona, father of 8, so for the record, the first guest that has more kids than me, and it's not even close. So congratulations on that, and also expecting a grandchild soon. So just it gets exponential growth from here, Alan. Congratulations.
There we go.
Founder of Momentum Capital Group, real estate investor and entrepreneur, and a volunteer pilot as well that he's very passionate about, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But before we do, Alan, kind of let's step back and what got all this started? What were your roots? Where'd you come from, and how did you get into, I guess, even entrepreneurship in general?
Yeah, entrepreneurship in general was kind of accidental. When I was 21 years old, I was working as a regional manager for Subway. I was overseeing 6 stores, and the owner of those stores had an idea for a different restaurant concept that he wanted to do, sent me to check it out, and I thought it was a great idea and did a bunch of research, and at the end of the day, he got cold feet, and I decided to push forward. So I went to my dad and I said, "Hey, I've got tons of experience, 6 months of experience in the restaurant business, so I want to start a restaurant." And for reasons unknown to me, he thought that would be a good idea too. So we started a pizza restaurant together. Um, Miraculously, it didn't fail. It succeeded. We ended up having 4 locations that I ended up selling a few years later. And I'll never forget, on the day that we sold, I was driving home and my dad called and he says, "Hey, I hear you're unemployed now." And I went, "Well, yeah, I guess I am." And my dad was a partner in some car dealerships, and he says, "Hey, we need somebody to manage a car dealership. Would you be interested in doing that?" I said, "Sure, why not? Can't be that much different than doing pizza restaurants." So I went to work and I learned a couple of things really quickly from that experience. Thing number one is I hated being an employee. And thing number two was that cars made a whole lot more money than pizza. So I decided that I'd open a car dealership, and did that about 4 years. Learned from my dad and for about 4 years, and then broke off, went on my own, and I had really excellent timing in that decision. We opened in May of 2007, right before the financial markets tanked, and I was pretty certain that first year that I'd be living under a bridge. I went from making pretty good money working for somebody else to pretty lousy money working for myself. I'll tell you, just one of the most memorable experiences from that time was I can remember one morning. My oldest son was probably 6 or 7 years old at the time, and we were praying as a family. He was praying, and he prayed that I would be able to sell a car so that we wouldn't lose our house.
Wow.
And you want to talk about motivation that day is I felt like I had not just the mortgage on my shoulders, but this kid's faith. and I was bound and determined that I wouldn't come home until I'd sold something.
What
I don't know if it would have been so bad if we'd lost the house, but if his prayer had gone unanswered and it was my fault, then that would have been a disaster for sure. So, that was the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey, and that car business grew year over year, every year over $1 million. And when we exited in 2020, we were doing over $16 million a year.
So I want to try to take it back or just recall like your thought process, not not necessarily the pressure from your son, but at the time. So I think you said you opened this in 2007. So let's just say 2008. While you were struggling, you also said you realized you hated to be an employee. And the reason I'm asking this, I guess, is there's people out there that are employees, and some people love what they do, some people don't love what they do, but they also don't take the jump because of the risk and because of the situation you found yourself in that first year, I think. So help those folks understand how bad was it? I mean, you kind of talked about the story with your son, but how bad was it? Were you regretting it at that time? Like, what was your thought process during that period?
I don't think I ever regretted the decision to open the business. I worried about how we were going to make it financially. I mean, it was bad enough that we were receiving financial support from our church. They were helping to pay the utility bills. They were helping to provide groceries. That year, um, I'll never forget that Christmas. We had a knock on the door, and my wife and I had pretty much decided there wasn't going to be a Christmas, and we don't know who it was to this day, but we opened the door and there were gifts for the entire family on our doorstep. And it was, I do remember, going to the food pantry with my wife, and I was so embarrassed to be there. I couldn't even go in. I was just so crushed. And when we got done, she came back and I just said, I promise you that this will never happen again. We will never ever be in this situation again. And um, I don't think it was because of that promise necessarily, but we haven't been in that position. But it certainly wasn't easy. It was a real struggle, and there were other struggles that came along, but it was never quite as desperate as what that first year was.
And your kids were how old at that time? I have a question around that.
Yeah, so my oldest then would have been 7, and when we opened, and then my youngest would have been 1.
Because so I asked what you were feeling at the time, then also whether that was 5 years later or 10 years later. And I wonder what perspective, if your kids remember that, or if you talk about that, and what perspective it provided your family when you came from literally, I mean, we probably both think about how can we help others during Christmas. Well, you were that family. So how did you
Yeah.
think about that, or how do you look back at that?
Well, that's a mixed bag, so I opened the business with the idea of that I wanted to spend more time with my family. And that was actually the exact opposite
Mm-hmm.
of what happened. I would often leave the house at 4 o'clock in the morning so I could get to the auto auctions that I needed to go to. In fact, a number of years, I would leave the house Monday morning, go to an auto auction, go to the dealership, get on a plane, fly to California, be at auto auctions Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, fly to Las Vegas, be in an auto auction, fly home Friday night, work all day Saturday. And so I was basically home on Sunday. And um, we just recently had all of our older kids were working with a life coach, different life coaches, and part of that opportunity was me sitting with my oldest son and listening to his experience there, and how that's influenced and affected the relationship that we have now. Like, one of his first memories, a really good memory that he had, was when I just took time to jump on the trampoline with him, because I was never around. And when that changed and I was more available and then trying to reconnect, it took some time for him to be able to trust that even though was saying that I was going to be there and I wanted to hang out with him and we were going to spend this day together, he had half of his lifetime of not having that expectation and that not being the reality. So, there were a lot of sacrifices that were made, some that were probably not necessary. Um, but part of that too is we only can perform to the level of our knowledge. And both my dad and my grandpa had taught me that the way to succeed is show up early, stay late, and work harder than everybody else. So for basically the first 20 years of my professional career, my entrepreneurial journey, that's exactly the formula that I applied. I showed up early, I stayed late, and I worked harder than everybody else. Now, I've since figured out that there are some other ways to do it. I still think you have to work hard. Sometimes you have to show up early, sometimes you have to stay up late, but that's not the only way. Um, and doing it all over again, I sure hope that I could reapply, the lessons that I've learned now and not make such a big sacrifice of time with my family.
Yeah. Well, that's just a really neat story, and it does really make you think about, like, you don't, on one hand, you don't get those years back when your kids were really young, and there's also, there's statistics, your kids from the age before the age of 18, you're going to spend 90 to 95% of the time that you spend with your kids are during those years. So if you cut that a little bit short, that's a challenge. However, the sacrifices you made in those early years also probably enabled you to have more freedom later. So, um, it's really the knowledge, gaining the knowledge, I think, to set up your first to select a successful business or a profitable business, and then gaining the knowledge to set it up so that, yes, you still have to work hard and there's going to be late nights, but it's not nonstop and constant, right? To build a team around, to lead the business systems and structure. So tell me, I guess, from that time period through the exit in 2020, kind of what were some of the major things or shifts or just aha moments, whatever it might be, that happened in your business to kind of help you grow out of that?
Well, one of those was good people. Um, we seem to do a really good job surrounding ourselves with good people. And when I say we, my business partner and I. So my dad was a partner. Also, I had a brother-in-law who was a partner. But we hired some good people that were better at selling than us. And honestly, somebody that first year, right at the end of that first year, we created a relationship with a lender that completely changed things. And we ended up becoming the number one dealer in the country for 4 years in a row with this lender. Um, and so they sent a rep to ask us what the secret to our success was. And I said, "Oh, I can share that with you. It's no problem." I said, "When we get here, we pray together, then we work hard and we treat people right." And she kind of laughed and she's like, "I can't go back and share that with the bank." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know what else to tell you then because I'm not any smarter than that. I I pray hard, I work hard, and I treat people right." And I think that was the key to our success all the way through. And we also weren't afraid to make changes. So the location that we started at um, it started out as a junkyard that we remodeled. A nicer location on a corner became available. And even though financially it seemed like a stretch, and honestly, there wasn't the support of my partners to do it, I knew it was the right decision. And so we made the leap, and that it was like triple the rent that we had. And so it was scary, but that turned out to be a huge boost for us. Um, so I would think that would be the other thing is, nobody is going to know better how to run your business than you do. And oftentimes I think we ignore the inspiration that we get as entrepreneurs. But if we can follow that and act on it fairly quickly, at least in my experience, things usually turn out pretty good.
So first of all, I love that, and I loved it, just the idea of like how you treat your employees. I mean, praying together and just out loud and together and getting aligned on like what you want for the company, what your real core values are, I think is so important. So that's really fantastic stuff. And of course, work ethic. So you exited, if I'm jumping too far, tell me, but you exited in 2020. What was what led up to that? What was kind of the thought process? Why did you want to do that?
Yeah, well, there wasn't thought process and I didn't want to do it. So we'll start with that.
Flip the question to whatever makes sense.
Um, there's I've learned something about myself since then that I didn't know then, and that I love being a creator. I love starting things. I don't necessarily love running them. So after about 5 years, maybe 6 years with the car dealerships, we'd gotten it to a point where things were running well, systems were in place, and it was kind of boring for me. Um, and if I knew this about myself then, I would have been more diligent about really nailing in the systems and processes so I could step further away and look for other opportunities. But I didn't know that about myself at the time. And so what actually ended up happening is things were humming along pretty good. 2016, my youngest daughter is born with a serious birth defect called gastroschisis. And gastroschisis is where the abdomen doesn't fully close. So she was born with all of her intestines outside of her body. Obviously, very high risk. We spent a long time in the neonatal intensive care unit in the NICU. And what that meant for our family was we had seven other kids, seven older siblings. We were homeschooling the kids at that time. And I was trying to run not only the car dealerships, but an insurance company and a service repair shop that we'd started. So we have several small businesses we're trying to run, trying to homeschool kids. And one of us, my wife or I, is 24/7 with the new baby. And it was extremely taxing. It was exhausting. And then for whatever reason, Marin, who's our youngest, didn't sleep through the night for the next 2 years. So we went from 2016 to 2018 with basically she would sleep for about an hour at a time. And so we were living on interrupted sleep, sleep deprivation torture for 2 years. And then in 2018, we find out that my mother-in-law has cancer and we lose her a week later. She never even came out of the hospital. Um, she was my wife's best friend. They lived a mile away. They walked together every morning. Um, it's almost impossible to quantify the impact that that had on her and by default on our family. A few months later, her dad's cancer, which had been in remission, came back very aggressively. And we spent about the next 6 or 8 months caring for him almost full time. He had a surgery that removed the entire lower portion of his jaw and replaced it. He was in constant pain. That didn't take the cancer away. And 13 months after she lost her mom, we lost her dad as well. Unfortunately, her family didn't handle that loss very well. There was some dispute over assets. So not only did she lose her mom and her dad, but also all of her siblings. So my kids lost all their aunts and uncles, all their cousins, two of the grandparents. And um, the way that my father-in-law passed away was extremely traumatic for me. So the cancer ruptured his carotid artery, and I found him bleeding to death on his kitchen floor. And called the brother-in-law who's a firefighter and said, "Hey, what do I do? Here's the situation." And at that point, hospice was already involved. And he said, "Well, on the counter, there's these two medications. If you give him this amount, he's going to go to sleep and, you'll help him pass." So that's what I did. I gave him a lethal injection. And I wouldn't change those actions. But also I didn't realize the mental and emotional impact that that would take on me. It really started a downward spiral. I struggled for the next year just to function. it was extremely traumatic. And in the background, we've got this stuff going on with her family. And then October of 2020, so we're right in the grips of COVID, and the world's kind of going crazy. Um, and I had just started some grief counseling actually to help with grief for my in-laws. And I'll never forget it. I still have the text message. I get a text from my brother who was going through a divorce at the time, living with my parents. Hey, dude, I think dad just had a stroke. How soon can you get here? And 3 days later, my dad passed away. So, in the space of 2 years, we pretty much lost my entire family on my wife's side, lost my dad. And I remember walking into my business partner's office and I said, "Hey, man, like I'm in really rough shape right now. I can't do this anymore. I'm really concerned. I've locked my guns away, and I need to get out." And his response was, I can't run this without you. And so I said, well, if you can't run it and I can't run it, then we can't do this anymore. So I went to a friend who also owned car dealerships, and I said, hey, here's my situation. I have to get out of this. I'd like to be done by December. What do you offer me? He offered about $100,000 for a business that was doing $16 million a year. We had 30,000 Facebook followers. I mean, in retrospect, terrible deal. Um, but the reality is for me, it was a life and death decision. And so I shook his hand. We didn't even have a contract or paperwork. He handed me 100 grand in cash. I shook his hand, gave my partner his portion, and right around right around the first part of 2021, uh, walked out and started a journey of really trying to find myself and put life back together again.
Wow. For a lot of people, they can't imagine losing anyone, losing a parent or an in-law, and to lose three within a couple of years, and then just in the manner and really the I don't want to say like how quickly they happened. Um, that's yeah, I can't imagine. And how how do you I don't know if it's how do you manage that situation with your family because you're also trying to be a strong father to your family, but also when does this where do you go and where how do you what did you pivot to? Like when did the pivot start to happen to I don't know if you completely ever get over it, but when did the pivot start to happen or what was the key kind of moments that helped you turn things, towards the better for yourself?
Well, you know, there's a lot to unpack in that question, but to paint the image, I'd like to imagine like my whole family being together and we get hit by a bomb, right? And the first thing that you're trying to do is just trying to figure out what happened, and then you're assessing how you're doing, and you're damaged and bleeding and broken, and that's where I was. So I didn't have the capacity at the beginning to even think about what was going on with my family because I was so damaged myself. And so the first part was just trying to figure out how to heal. I did some grief counseling. I would say there was marginal success there. It probably has more to do with the fact that, um, again, since I've learned it, it just wasn't the right fit for me. But I got to a point where I had decided I'd talked to a friend who had gone through, he was an orthodontist. He'd gone through a serious midlife crisis and kind of the same as me, had ended up walking away from his business and called him to see because now that version of him owned like 40 orthodontic clinics, a couple of private jets. Like there was such a stark contrast. And he said, I went to this mental health retreat for a month. And he goes, it was basically 10 hours a day of therapy. very controlled diet. And so I looked into it, um, and it didn't seem like the right fit for me. And around that time, I had written down on a note card, there's three miracles that I need from God. I need the miracle of happiness, I need the miracle of prosperity, and I need the miracle of knowing that my life has some sort of purpose. Because at that point, I didn't feel happy, certainly wasn't prospering, and really could not identify a purpose. And really within probably a week or so of that being a constant prayer, I had what at the time seemed like a crazy idea that I should go take a flying lesson. Now, I'd always wanted to fly airplanes. I just had never allowed myself to do it. And part of the reason for that is my wife's uncle had been killed in a small plane crash. So there was a pretty strong reason in our family for me not to do this. Um, but I went to my wife and if there's one thing that's been an underpinning constant is I can never remember a time when my wife hasn't 100,000% supported me. And so I went to her with this crazy idea. Alan's wants to fly an airplane. And I said, I know this is a big ask. Why don't you pray about it and let me know what your thoughts are? And the next day she came back and she said, God told me that he would hold your life in his hands, and I think you should do it. So I did. I went and took a flying lesson, and I will never ever forget the feeling that I had when we took off. Um, it felt as if this broken, damaged, sad person stayed on the ground, and there was this new creature that was up in the air, and he was excited and happy and learning and growing. And I dove, that period of my life, I say that I was gainfully unemployed. Fortunately, we had some assets and we weren't totally destitute, but um, I also wasn't working. And so naturally, I bought an airplane and threw myself into this new passion. Um, the amount of knowledge that I had to obtain, the focused intention that I had to have, allowed me to change where I was, change my mind, and and I thought, man, there's got to be some way that I can use this thing to help other people who are hurting. And so I started Googling aviation charities. I found an organization called Angel Flight West that does free flights for people in need of non-emergency medical care far from home. Great example of that is my very first flight. There was a young man who was driving 6 hours 3 times a week to get cancer treatment. He was 18 years old. And my flight with him was an hour and 15 minutes. It's life changing for people. And put yourself in an airplane with a 2-year old, 5-year old, 10-year old, 66-year-old who is fighting for their life. All of a sudden, you realize your life's pretty good. No matter what else is going on, you're still the guy flying the airplane, providing the service, and this person's fighting for their life. So, um, in this hobby of flying airplanes, I found happiness, I found purpose, and to my great surprise, being a pilot is a rare enough commodity that when I started learning about real estate, I'd go to conventions and local meetups, and people would find out I was a pilot, and all of a sudden they were super interested in me. And so I'm not, I wouldn't call myself the brightest bulb in the box, but I'm bright enough to recognize an opportunity. And so, if you and I were at a real estate meetup and I thought, man, this guy's super interesting, I'd like to learn more about him. If I were to say, hey, how would you like to spend 4 or 5 hours together on Saturday morning? You'd probably say, no, thanks, dude. Appreciate it. Why don't we do a Zoom call? But if I say, hey, I own an airplane and I'm going to fly to Sedona, where the red rocks are, there's a great cafe at the at the airport. We'll have breakfast. We'll circle around, check out the views, and then we'll come back. Would you like to come with me? Nobody ever says no to that.
I'm in.
And so that led to business opportunities, partnerships, tremendous relationships, great friendships, and it gave me another thing that I could give to someone else where I wasn't asking for anything, I was giving them something. And that's led to prosperity. And so, that's the really condensed version. There's also been breath work. There's been a serious focus on meditation. I'm in the middle of completely redefining my health. I have a goal to lose 43 pounds. I'm about halfway through that right now. And so the short answer is I had to become a completely different person. The long answer is that's really difficult work, and I still struggle with it every day. Yeah, even we've raised $6 or $7 million of capital in less than a year. We're in the middle of deploying or developing somewhere between 30 and $50 million of property in San Diego, and there's still days where I feel like a complete failure. Like I'm just like, man, I really suck at this.
But those are
Um,
temporary. And
yeah,
I want to pause because first of all, I didn't need to pause to ask questions or anything because those last several minutes were heartwarming and just great information. Um, if I go back to the passing of your in-laws and your dad, and I think at that time, as that was happening, you weren't clear, you hadn't thought about a purpose. Those events and that pain perhaps led you to find your purpose. But do you think for others, if you had had a purpose before then, does that help you through that, or that's just going to be such a painful process no matter what? Where if you would have been clear on your purpose prior, because there's so many people like flying for you, they thought about it, they've wondered about it. Maybe they didn't get clear that it was their purpose, but they've
yeah.
definitely thought about things and they keep thinking about the same thing and wondering about it, but not doing it until maybe a certain time in their life or a life event, I don't know, wakes them up to say go do it. So is it helpful? Do you think it would have been helpful? Or sometimes, yeah, I guess that's the first question. Would have it been helpful as those things have happened if you had already had clarity of what your purpose was?
Yeah, and I would rephrase that a little. I don't think that flying is my purpose. I think it's a way to express my purpose.
Hmm.
One of the greatest lessons that I've learned in the last 3 years has been love for myself and love for others, unconditionally for myself and without reservation for other people. And so helping others develop love for themselves and me expressing love for others is um, the purpose.
Yeah.
That's
Flying
that
the
is
vehicle to get you in
flying
the
as a
seat.
vehicle. Now, I don't know that I needed those experiences to be able to get that kind of clarity when really your life is reduced to such desperation that you have to find the solution, and it has to be something that's permanent. It can't be transitory. Um, you look differently, and so we've had this conversation because my wife is, with what we're doing in real estate. It was an unknown, and she asked me, she's like, well, what if we go through the same set of circumstances? What if it doesn't work out? You know? And I said, well, if it doesn't work out, we'll be okay because I know who I am. I know who we are. Um, I know who God is and what his relationship is to me in all of this, and we'll be okay. And so, yeah, certainly if I'd been able to figure that out with more clarity prior to all this stuff, yeah, it would have been way better. And I love the fact that you brought up, I had been thinking about, I'd been to air shows, I'd hung out at airports. My first date with my wife was at an airport. This is something that had been on my mind since I was a little kid. And I think each of us probably has something like that. Maybe it's cycling for somebody, maybe it's painting for somebody, writing poetry. For me, it happens to be flying airplanes. The ability to do that now motivates everything else that I do. Why do I want to make a ton of money in real estate? Well, because that gives me the ability to do 6 or 8 or 10 flights every single month for somebody else rather than one or two. Why do I want to get healthy? Well, because if I'm not healthy, the FAA takes away my license and I can't fly the airplanes and I can't provide the service. You know, so it helps me to maintain absolute clarity on where I want to go and who I am. And however you get there, coaches have helped a ton. Man, I wish I'd figured out counseling and coaching when I was 20 years old instead of 47. Like that would have been such a life hack. That's
Hmm.
why all of my oldest kids have worked with a life coach now, because I want to give them what I didn't have.
Um, so the other thing, I've talked about this a little bit, but when you decided you want to go fly, my understanding of your story is you didn't have any clarity about Angel Flight West. You just wanted to fly, and you just went
Yeah.
after your what I think was your passion,
Yep.
and you couldn't connect the dots forward. You had no idea how this would evolve. You just said, "I'm going to go do this." And I think
Yep.
the other message is like the worst thing that would could happen. Okay, you talked about a family member and like, yeah, I guess flying, there's risk to it, but a lot of times the worst thing that could happen if people just pursue their passion isn't life and death. It isn't that situation.
Right.
And the best thing that can happen is often not what we can comprehend. You did not even comprehend that this could lead to Angel Flight West and spending hours upon hours with sick people and having not only a huge impact on them, but a huge impact, I think, on yourself through
Yeah.
that process just by giving you lessons from people that are in poor health or dying, phenomenal perspective about your own life and how blessed you are. So I just my point or takeaway there is that you just really cannot connect the dots forward. You do not know. Go pursue something, getting comfortable with going into the fog sometime and not knowing what's on the other side of the fog.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I'll share it because this was only about 6 months ago. I was walking out of my office and I just stopped because it just hit me like a lightning bolt. Up until that point, for probably 3 years, I had tried different businesses. I had started a bunch of different businesses and they all made money, but none of them got me to where I wanted to go until this opportunity, Momentum Capital Group out of San Diego with Christian Ballou. Um, But what each of those failures did is they taught me something that I needed to know so that I could be the partner that I needed to be when this opportunity became available in San Diego. I did fix and flip. How I was fixing and flipping houses in Phoenix. That made enough money to pay the bills. Wasn't something I was passionate about, not something I really loved, but it was enough um, but guess what? I need the knowledge of how that works to do what I'm doing right now. In another partnership, we learned how to put together investment funds. I didn't end up putting together a fund with that partnership, but guess what? That's what I do in the current partnership. That's my primary role because that's the knowledge that I have. Um, I started a solar company. Again, it paid the bills. Not really something I love to do, but guess what? Every new construction in California has to have solar. And so
Right,
now when I meet with the solar salesperson, I
right.
know exactly what we have to have and what that needs to do. So I'm not ignorant. But I didn't know any of that while I was going through it. I just felt like I was failing a lot. And there were points where I was just like, at what point do I succeed again like I was doing with the car business? Because that seemed, in retrospect, I was like, man, I was crushing it, forgetting that, there were lots of years where I wasn't. Um, and I read something online the other day that most entrepreneurs will feel like they're failing 97% of the time. And I feel like that's totally true. I think I get to celebrate wins 2 or 3% of the time. The exception to that is when I'm flying the airplane, that always feels like a win.
And I think that to have that perspective and for entrepreneurs to understand that, because a lot of times, first of all, I just appreciate your vulnerability, because a lot of times people listen to podcasts, maybe they're on social media, and we see all the good stuff, but we don't see the 97%, right? We don't people aren't posting about 97 failures and three successes. They're posting about, three successes that are real and maybe three successes that are not. I don't know, but you get the point, right? So the other thing I maybe want to spend a minute or two on is the life coaching. And I've worked with coaches too in the past, and I think I think there's just a stigma in our society that that's counseling, or if you do that, you have issues. Well, to me, if you need that, it's because you're this thing called a human, right? And it can be
Right.
helpful. And I think it just builds, you said something earlier on just the process of building I wrote down self awareness and getting, surrounding yourself with people, professionals that can help you build your own self-awareness as to who you are, and the fact that it's been so impactful for you that you're applying that to your kids. So tell me about maybe even the process with your children and whatever you're willing to share.
And I was sharing just where I was at, my healing journey, and another guy there said, "Well, hey, how are your kids doing?" I said, "Well, I think they're fine." He goes, "Have you been fine for the last few years?" I'm like, "No, I've been a wreck." And he's like, "Well, you were a wreck and you have an adult mind and adult emotions." He's like, "Your teenagers don't have the benefit of any of that or the life experience that you have. They're probably not okay." And I was like, "Oh, wow. Okay." Completely ignorant father. Um, and so he actually ended up giving me a recommendation for a coach. And so called her, explained the situation. She was willing to meet with the kids one on one. Three of the kids ended up working with her. One of the kids was a better fit with another coach. They met virtually, um, usually once a week. It was for about an hour at a time. And I don't understand the magic that coaches work. They have a gift, in my opinion, from God, where they have the ability to deconstruct what's going on in somebody's mind and in their heart. And through the gift of communication, they're able to help them see themselves and make advances. And it has been, for me, miraculous to see the growth that my kids have had. So not my oldest daughter, but the next youngest four, down to my 14-year-old at the time, all worked with a coach for about a year. And the change that I saw in them would have been worth any price. That will be standard practice in the Underwood family now for teenagers to be able to work with a life coach if they want to. Um, to have somebody other than mom or dad that they can go to and just say, "Hey, here's what I'm thinking, here's how I'm feeling," and have another trusted adult guide them through those emotions, man, invaluable.
What comes to mind there is not just as the life coaching example, but anytime we're thinking about any sort of investment in ourselves, education, mentorship around faith, around health, around business, around life, whatever that is, a lot of times, admittedly for me, I think about that for me. I think about the
Yeah,
impact that that will have for me. But like, so we've used a health coach in the past, and that impact for me, that's not just impacting me, it has helped me. Just that investment alone is worth it. But it's impacting my wife, it's impacting my kids, it's helping all of us. So if you're
yeah.
thinking about making these investments, what you learn from coaches, memberships, mentors, that's going to have an impact, not just on your not just you. It's going to have an impact that you can pass along to your kids. So that's just such a good example. And maybe not everyone works, right? But if you do it, you're going to find impactful relationships and education that you are going to be able to apply to your family. So I really love that.
100%. Yeah, and not every, I've joined a lot of different groups. Most of them was kind of a one and done experience. You know, I learned something, but it wasn't the right fit. But when you find the right one, it's magical
Yeah.
what can happen.
When you When you just step back and reflect on what you do, how does that make you feel?
So I have on my vision board up here, part of my journey was just discovering what my core values are. It's the acronym MALRAT, and it's making a difference, adventure, leadership, relationships, autonomy, and trust. The reason why flying airplanes, serving people with Angel Flight West, uh, dedicating time to being a good dad and a better husband, helping investors attain financial freedom works for me is because all those things are in alignment with who I am. And, I get, and that's part of my decision making process now. When I have an opportunity come across my desk, I can just turn and look and say, does this make a difference for me or for someone else? Is this adventurous? Is it fun? Um, is there leadership for me or for somebody else? How does this affect the relationships in my life? Do I have autonomy or am I going to be a slave to somebody else? And is there trust involved? If I can check all or most of those boxes, then it's probably a pretty good thing to do. If I'm missing on a bunch of those, it's a pretty easy no. So, and for me, I want to live my life as an edifier, which to me means I inspire, build, and lead myself and others. And that's how I want to approach life.
Love that. And honestly, to have the clarity of core values and using it as a filtering mechanism, I think is so important because there can be so many distractions in life. So just to be able to stay focused, I think is so important. Um, what would you say has been your key factor to success or will be your key factor to significance?
My relationship with God is number one. The love and support of my wife is number two. And number three, and I guess three and four, I would combine these two, would be what I said before, love for myself and love for others. Um, if I'm in alignment with those things, if I'm acting in a way that's in alignment with what God's desire is for my life, if I'm acting in a way that honors and um, that can have the support of my wife, if I'm acting in a way that develops love for myself and love for other people, things are going to work out.
I would take that a step further that if you stay in line with those things, you cannot fail. You,
Yeah.
you, you cannot fail. So fantastic. What is a really impactful business or real estate book that you've read and why?
The Go Giver. Yeah.
I Fantastic. Art, we had him on the podcast, Bob Berg, and the book has been mentioned a couple different times.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic book. Um,
Transformative for me. I mean,
yeah,
that's it. I think that's intuitively how I was trying to do things already. It really helped to clarify
yeah.
that vision for myself, and it's given me a great teaching tool for my kids and for others to be able to say, that's what you want? Okay, well, go give it to somebody else. I guarantee you'll get it.
And
So,
so now our listeners have heard that I don't know how many times. And the way you need to look at books is you just need to order it. It's $15 or 20. I don't know what it is, but just order the book and read it because people keep bringing it up and I love the word transformative, right? And I agree with you. When you said that, I was shaking because I hadn't thought of it before. But when you read that book, you might think about parts of that and you've heard service and serve others before, but just the clarity it provides in the story, I think is so solid. And it was very clarifying for me as well. What about a very impactful personal development book?
personal development book. There's been a few. Um, yeah, I would say the most impactful has been The Miracle Morning Millionaire. And that's because it led me to reading The Tribe of Millionaires. And that led me to joining GoBundance, which um, the relationships in that organization have been so critical to my personal growth. Um, eh, Man, I just can't. There, it would be impossible for me to describe in 1 or 2 minutes the impact that has had. And that book was really what kicked it off. But it wasn't exactly the book; it's where the book led me. And
Yeah.
that can happen when you read a good book too. It may not be that thing that changes your life.
Right.
It might just be the path that it puts you on.
100%. You cannot connect the dots. You don't know where, but just keep moving, keep taking action to where your heart is calling you. So, man, Alan, this is one of my favorites. I mean, this is really up there, and honestly, the vulnerability. And I think, I hear this on other podcasts, but a lot of times you're put in positions, or I should say, you're best suited to help other people or to help your former self. So
For
the
sure.
things that you have been through, you're in a great position to help other people that maybe are going through that now or will be going through it. So really, um, a challenging story, but very heartwarming, and it's great to see you doing so well. And honestly, just leading all of that leading to happiness, happiness, prosperity, and purpose, I think is so good. So, Alan, I appreciate it so much. How can people find out more about you?
Pretty easy to find. LinkedIn is a good place. Instagram, I think both of those places. I'm the Alan Underwood. Those are easy places to find me. You can look up the Momentum Capital Group out of San Diego. Uh, that may or may not be easier to find than finding me. Those are the two easiest places, probably.
Alan, once again, thanks so much for being so open with us, and we appreciate it. For the Muller Real Estate and Business Podcast, signing off. Thank you for listening to the Muller Real Estate and Business Podcast. We hope you found today's episode helpful. If you know current or aspiring investors or entrepreneurs or anyone that would benefit from today's episode, we appreciate you sharing it with them, or better yet, providing us a 5-star review. To learn more about Muller Real Estate, visit our website at www.mullerre.com. You can also sign up for our newsletter or local events via our website. In closing, I encourage you to be purposeful in all areas of life, educate yourself, network with others that have been successful, take action, and lead. Thank you.